Princess Catherine Margaret Elizabeth Windsor stood before the massive mirror in her private chambers, watching her lady-in-waiting, Mrs. Hartwell, adjust the delicate pearl necklace that had belonged to her grandmother. The 18-year-old princess felt the familiar weight of expectation settling on her shoulders like a heavy cloak. Tonight was different from any other formal dinner she had attended in her young life. "Remember, Your Highness," Mrs. Hartwell said softly, her weathered hands gentle as they smoothed Catherine's midnight blue silk gown. "Tonight you dine with the foreign ambassadors. Your father, His Majesty, has made it very clear that protocol must be followed to the letter." Catherine nodded, though her stomach churned with nervousness. She had been preparing for this evening for weeks, studying the intricate rules of diplomatic dining, learning about each guest who would be present, and, most importantly, remembering the one rule that her father, King Edward, had impressed upon her since childhood: never leave the dining table before the king rises first. This rule was not merely about manners or tradition. It was about respect, authority, and the very foundation of royal protocol that had governed their kingdom for centuries. To break this rule, especially in front of foreign dignitaries, would be seen as the ultimate act of disrespect and could potentially damage diplomatic relations that had taken years to build. "Tell me again, Mrs. Hartwell," Catherine said, turning away from her reflection. "Why is this rule so important? I understand protocol, but tonight feels different somehow." Mrs. Hartwell's expression grew serious. She had served the royal family for 30 years and had seen the consequences of even small breaches in protocol. "Your Highness, when your great-grandfather was king, there was an incident at a state dinner with the Emperor of Aldoria. A young princess from a neighboring kingdom left the table before the king had risen. It was seen as such an insult that it nearly caused a war. Diplomatic relations were severed for 15 years. Catherine felt a chill run down her spine. She had heard whispers of this story before, but Mrs. Hartwell's serious tone made the reality of it sink in deeper. "But surely people understand that sometimes there might be emergencies. In the world of royalty and diplomacy, Your Highness, there are no acceptable emergencies when it comes to basic protocol. The rule exists to show that the monarch's authority is absolute and respected by all, even his own family. Your father has spent months preparing for tonight's dinner. The trade agreements and peace treaties that will be discussed could secure prosperity for our kingdom for generations." As they made their way down the grand staircase toward the formal dining room, Catherine's mind raced. She had attended dozens of state dinners before, but tonight's guest list was particularly distinguished. The ambassador from the Eastern Empire, Lord Blackwood, was known for his sharp eye for protocol breaches. The Countess of Northbridge, representing the Northern Territories, had a reputation for reporting even the smallest infractions to her own royal court. Most intimidating of all was Prince Alessandro from the Southern Isles, whose own kingdom was known for its extremely rigid adherence to formal protocols. The massive doors to the royal dining hall opened before them, and Catherine was momentarily overwhelmed by the grandeur of the scene. The table stretched nearly the length of the room, set with the finest china, crystal, and silverware. Hundreds of candles flickered in golden candelabras, casting dancing shadows on the silk-covered walls. Fresh flowers from the royal gardens created elaborate centerpieces, and the air was perfumed with the subtle scent of roses and jasmine. King Edward stood at the head of the table in his formal military dress uniform, his chest adorned with medals and honors earned through years of service to the crown. His presence commanded immediate respect, and even the most powerful dignitaries waited for his acknowledgement before taking their seats. Catherine felt a surge of pride watching her father in his element, but also an increased awareness of the responsibility that would one day be hers. "Princess Catherine," her father said warmly as she approached, though his eyes conveyed the serious message they had discussed privately earlier that day. "You look beautiful. Please take your seat." Catherine's assigned place was halfway down the table, positioned strategically between Lord Blackwood and the Duchess of Westmere. As she settled in her chair, She noticed how every guest waited patiently until the king himself was seated before they followed suit. The synchronization was perfect, a ballet of respect and protocol that had been refined over centuries. The first course was served with military precision by the royal staff. Catherine had always admired how seamlessly the palace operated during these formal occasions. Each server knew exactly when to appear, how to present each dish, and when to retreat silently into the background. The conversation flowed around topics of trade, weather, and cultural exchanges, carefully avoiding any controversial subjects that might create tension. Princess Catherine, Lord Blackwood said during a pause in conversation, I understand you have been studying the history of diplomatic relations between our kingdoms. Your reputation for intelligence and grace precedes you. Catherine smiled graciously, remembering her lessons in diplomatic conversation. Thank you, Lord Blackwood. I find the evolution of international relationships fascinating. It's remarkable how much can be accomplished when nations approach each other with mutual respect and understanding. Prince Alessandro, seated across from her, nodded approvingly. Wise words, Your Highness. In my travels, I have observed that the greatest diplomatic successes come from those who understand that small gestures often carry the greatest meaning. Catherine felt the weight of his words, knowing that her behavior tonight was exactly one of those small gestures that could carry enormous meaning. Every movement, every word, every expression was being observed and potentially judged by these experienced diplomats who were accustomed to reading subtle signs of disrespect or approval. As the evening progressed through multiple courses, Catherine found herself genuinely enjoying the conversations. Lord Blackwood shared fascinating stories about the trade routes through the Eastern Empire, while the Countess of Northbridge described the amazing innovations in agriculture happening in the Northern Territories. Prince Alessandro spoke eloquently about the artistic renaissance taking place in the Southern Isles, and several other guests contributed their own perspectives on everything from literature to scientific discoveries. However, as the main course was being served, Catherine began to feel uncomfortable. At first, she attributed it to the richness of the food or perhaps the tight fitting of her corset. But as the discomfort grew stronger, she realized with growing alarm that she was developing what felt like the beginning symptoms of the stomach illness that had been affecting some of the palace staff recently. She tried to ignore the sensation, focusing intently on the conversation around her, and forcing herself to take small, careful bites of her food. The last thing she wanted was to cause any sort of scene or disruption during such an important diplomatic dinner. She glanced toward her father at the head of the table, who was engaged in an animated discussion about military strategy with several of the male ambassadors. Are you feeling quite well, Your Highness? The Duchess of Westmere asked quietly, leaning slightly toward Catherine with concern in her voice. I'm perfectly fine, thank you, Catherine replied with a smile that she hoped appeared more convincing than it felt. Just concentrating on this delicious meal and wonderful company. But as the evening wore on, Catherine's discomfort intensified. The room seemed to grow warmer, and she could feel perspiration beginning to form despite the cool evening air flowing through the open windows. Her hands trembled slightly as she reached for her water glass, and she had to concentrate hard to keep her breathing steady and normal. The irony of her situation was not lost on her. Here she was, surrounded by the most important diplomatic figures in the region, engaged in conversations that could shape the future of international relations, and all she could think about was the growing urgency of her physical discomfort and the one rule she absolutely could not break under any circumstances. Catherine looked down the long table toward her father, estimating that there were still at least 2 more courses to be served before the meal would conclude. The dessert course alone typically lasted 30 to 45 minutes, with coffee and after-dinner drinks extending the evening even further. She felt a wave of panic as she realized that she might not be able to endure the remaining time without needing to excuse herself. But excusing herself was impossible. The rule was absolute, and the consequences of breaking it in front of this particular group of guests were unthinkable. Catherine closed her eyes for just a moment, drawing on every ounce of royal training she had received since childhood. She had been taught to endure discomfort, to maintain composure under pressure, and to put duty before personal needs. Princess, Prince Alessandro said, drawing her attention back to the conversation, I was just telling Lord Blackwood about the magnificent library in your palace. I understand you have one of the finest collections of historical texts in this part of the world. Catherine forced herself to focus on his words and respond appropriately. Yes, our library is one of my father's great prides. We have manuscripts dating back over 5 centuries, including some original diplomatic treaties that established many of the relationships we celebrate today. As she spoke, Catherine realized that talking helped distract her from her physical discomfort, at least temporarily. She threw herself into the conversation with renewed energy, asking questions about the libraries and historical collections in the other kingdoms represented at the table. The discussion became quite animated, with several guests sharing stories about rare books and important documents they had encountered in their travels. But even as she participated actively in the conversation, Catherine could feel her situation becoming more desperate with each passing minute. The elegant dining room, with its beautiful tapestries and sparkling chandeliers, began to feel like an ornate prison. Every laugh from the other guests, every clink of silverware against fine china, every word of the ongoing conversations seemed to echo in her head as she struggled to maintain her composure. She found herself calculating distances and timing, wondering if there might be some way to signal for help without causing a scene. But even as these thoughts crossed her mind, she knew they were futile. There was no acceptable way to leave the table before the king rose, regardless of the circumstances. The rule had been established specifically to prevent exactly this kind of situation from creating diplomatic incidents. Catherine's gaze drifted again to her father, who was clearly in his element as he discussed various matters of state with the assembled dignitaries. King Edward's face showed the satisfaction of a successful diplomatic evening, and Catherine realized with a heavy heart that her own crisis could potentially destroy everything her father had worked so hard to achieve. As the dessert course was finally served, Catherine felt both relief and renewed anxiety. Relief that the meal was progressing towards conclusion, but anxiety because she knew that even after dessert, there would be toasts, coffee service, and the traditional after-dinner conversations that could extend the evening for another hour or more. The dessert was an elaborate creation of chocolate and berries, artfully arranged and clearly prepared by the palace's finest pastry chefs specifically for this important occasion. Under normal circumstances, Catherine would have thoroughly enjoyed the beautiful presentation and delicate flavors. Tonight, however, she could barely manage a few small bites while maintaining her smile and continuing to participate in the ongoing conversations around her. Your Highness, Lord Blackwood said, raising his wine glass slightly. I must say that this has been one of the most enjoyable and enlightening evenings I have experienced in many years of diplomatic service. Your father's hospitality and your own gracious presence have made this truly memorable. Catherine raised her own glass in response, her hand trembling only slightly as she did so. Thank you so much, Lord Blackwood. Having the opportunity to learn from all of you has been equally rewarding for me. As the toast concluded and conversation resumed around the table, Catherine realized that she had reached a critical point. Her physical discomfort had intensified to the point where she was no longer confident in her ability to maintain her composure much longer. Yet looking around the table at the satisfied faces of the distinguished guests, seeing the success of the evening written in their expressions, and hearing it in their animated conversations, she knew that she had to find a way to endure. The single rule that she must never break had never felt more important or more difficult to follow than it did in this moment. The crystal chandelier above seemed to spin slowly as Catherine gripped the edge of her chair, her knuckles white beneath her silk gloves. The dessert plates had been cleared away, and The servants were now preparing for the coffee service, which she knew from experience would take at least another 30 minutes. Her stomach cramped violently, and she had to bite the inside of her lip to prevent herself from gasping aloud. "Princess Catherine, you have grown quite pale," whispered the Duchess of Westmere, her voice barely audible above the general conversation. "Perhaps you should consider—" "I am perfectly fine," Catherine interrupted gently, but firmly, though her voice sounded strained even to her own ears. She could not allow anyone to suggest that she needed to leave, especially not in front of the foreign dignitaries who were watching her every move for signs of weakness or impropriety. Prince Alessandro, who had been observing Catherine carefully from across the table, leaned forward with apparent concern. "Your Highness, in the Southern Isles, we have a saying that courage sometimes means knowing when to retreat. There is no shame in acknowledging human limitations." Catherine felt a moment of gratitude for his kindness, but she also recognized the test inherent in his words. If she showed any sign of weakness now, it would be reported back to his kingdom and potentially used as evidence that the royal family of her nation lacked the strength and discipline necessary for serious diplomatic relationships. "Thank you for your concern, Prince Alessandro," she replied with as much dignity as she could muster. "However, I find that the most important moments in life are often those that require us to rise above our immediate circumstances. This evening has been far too valuable to cut short for any trivial reason." King Edward, catching the tail end of this exchange, looked down the table toward his daughter with pride and concern warring in his expression. Catherine met his eyes briefly and saw that he had recognized her distress, but also that he understood, as she did, that there was no acceptable solution that would not create a diplomatic incident. The coffee service began with the usual elaborate ceremony. Catherine watched as the royal butler approached each guest individually, offering various selections of coffee, tea, and after-dinner liqueurs. The ritual was beautiful and precise, but every minute felt like an hour as she struggled to maintain her composure. Lord Blackwood began telling a long story about a diplomatic mission he had undertaken to the Far Eastern kingdoms several years earlier. Under normal circumstances, Catherine would have found his tale fascinating, as it involved negotiations that had prevented a war between two powerful nations. Tonight, however, she found herself unable to focus on his words as waves of nausea and abdominal pain made it increasingly difficult to think clearly. "The most remarkable thing," Lord Blackwood continued, "was that the entire negotiation hinged on a seemingly minor point of protocol. The Eastern Emperor's daughter had been inadvertently seated in a position that suggested her father's kingdom was subordinate to his rival. It took 3 days of careful diplomacy to resolve the issue without anyone losing face. The irony of this story was not lost on Catherine, who was experiencing firsthand how seemingly minor breaches of protocol could have major consequences. She forced herself to nod and smile appropriately, even managing to ask a relevant question about the final resolution of the conflict, though the words felt like they were coming from someone else's mouth. "Fascinating," she managed to say. "It's remarkable how much meaning can be attached to what outsiders might see as small details." "Exactly," exclaimed the Countess of Northbridge. "That's why those of us in diplomatic circles must always be so careful about maintaining proper forms. Even the smallest deviation can be misinterpreted or seen as intentional disrespect." Catherine felt another wave of cramping and had to press her lips together tightly to prevent herself from making any sound. The conversation around her continued, but it seemed to be happening at a great distance, as if she were hearing it through thick glass. The elaborate dining room, with its gold-trimmed walls and priceless artwork, felt increasingly surreal as her physical distress intensified. She tried various mental techniques that her governess had taught her for dealing with stress and discomfort. She attempted to focus on her breathing, to visualize herself in a peaceful garden, to mentally recite poetry that she had memorized. Nothing seemed to help as her body's urgent signals became increasingly impossible to ignore. The conversation had moved on to trade agreements, and Catherine heard her father discussing the potential for increased commerce between their kingdom and several of the visiting nations. His voice carried the enthusiasm and confidence that she had always admired, and she realized that this dinner was accomplishing exactly what he had hoped. New partnerships were being forged, old alliances were being strengthened, and the foundation was being laid for treaties that could benefit their people for generations to come. This realization only intensified Catherine's determination to endure. She could not be the reason that this important evening was disrupted or that her father's diplomatic efforts were undermined. The rule about not leaving the table before the king was not just about protocol. It was about showing that the royal family could be trusted to honor their commitments no matter what personal cost was involved. Princess Catherine, Prince Alessandro said, drawing her back into the immediate conversation, "I've been thinking about your earlier comments regarding the importance of mutual respect in diplomatic relationships. In my experience, the most successful negotiations occur when all parties demonstrate their commitment to the process through their actions, not just their words." Catherine recognized the deeper meaning in his statement. He was testing whether she would maintain her commitment to proper protocol even under obvious duress. His own reputation would be partly based on how accurately he could assess the character and reliability of the royal family, with whom his kingdom might be entering into important agreements. "I completely agree," Catherine replied, her voice steady despite the turmoil in her body. True commitment is demonstrated most clearly when maintaining it requires personal sacrifice. Anyone can follow rules when it's convenient. Character is revealed when following those rules becomes difficult. King Edward smiled proudly at his daughter's response, though Catherine could see the concern in his eyes as he noted her pale complexion and the slight tremor in her hands. She knew that he was facing his own difficult choice between his role as a father who wanted to protect his child and his responsibility as a king who could not show favoritism or weakness in front of foreign dignitaries. The after-dinner liqueurs were served, along with delicate pastries that the palace kitchen had prepared specially for the evening. Catherine accepted a small glass of sherry, hoping that the alcohol might help settle her stomach. But after one tiny sip, she realized that it was only making her feel worse. She set the glass down carefully and focused on taking small, steady breaths. "Your Highness," the Duchess of Westmere said quietly, "are you quite certain you wouldn't prefer to retire? I'm sure everyone would understand if you were feeling unwell." The offer was kindly meant, but Catherine knew that accepting it would be interpreted as a sign of weakness by some of the more critical observers at the table. Moreover, her early departure would inevitably become the subject of diplomatic correspondence, potentially affecting her kingdom's reputation for reliability and strength. "Thank you for your concern," Catherine replied softly, "but I'm exactly where I wish to be. This evening has been far too enlightening to miss even a moment of it." As the conversation continued around her, Catherine found herself thinking about all the lessons she had learned about duty and sacrifice since childhood. Her tutors had taught her about previous royal family members who had endured incredible hardships to protect their kingdom's interests. She had read accounts of kings and queens who had continued to fulfill their obligations even when facing personal tragedies, illnesses, or other crises. One story that came to mind was that of her great-great-grandmother, Queen Isabella, who had continued to host a crucial peace negotiation even while grieving the death of her infant son. The negotiation had lasted for 3 days, during which Queen Isabella had never once shown her personal anguish in public, understanding that any sign of weakness could have been exploited by those who opposed the peace treaty. Another cramping wave hit Catherine with such intensity that she had to grip the arms of her chair to prevent herself from doubling over. The pain was becoming constant now rather than intermittent, and she was beginning to feel lightheaded as well. The voices around her seemed to fade in and out, and she had to concentrate hard to follow the ongoing conversations. Lord Blackwood was discussing the possibility of establishing a new trade route that would benefit all the kingdoms represented at the dinner. The economic implications were significant, and Catherine realized that the agreements being discussed tonight could potentially affect thousands of people in her own kingdom who depended on trade for their livelihoods. The key consideration, Lord Blackwood was saying, is ensuring that all parties feel they are receiving fair treatment. In my experience, the most durable agreements are those where everyone believes they are getting something valuable in exchange for what they are giving up. Catherine forced herself to focus on his words, recognizing their wisdom and relevance to her current situation. She was giving up her physical comfort and potentially her health to maintain diplomatic protocol, but in return, she was helping to ensure the success of negotiations that could benefit her entire kingdom. Prince Alessandro seemed to be studying her intently, and Catherine wondered if he was impressed by her determination or concerned about her obvious distress. In the diplomatic world, both responses were possible, and the interpretation would likely depend on his own kingdom's cultural values regarding duty and personal sacrifice. "Princess Catherine," he said suddenly, "I am curious about your thoughts on the balance between tradition and adaptability in modern diplomacy. How do we honor the wisdom of established protocols while remaining flexible enough to meet changing circumstances?" The question was clearly a test, and Catherine recognized that her answer would be carefully analyzed and reported back to his superiors. Despite her physical distress, she summoned all her mental resources to provide a thoughtful response. "I believe," she said slowly, choosing her words carefully, "that the most important traditions are those that embody timeless principles rather than arbitrary rules. When we understand why a particular protocol exists and what values it represents, we can honor those values even when specific circumstances might tempt us to abandon the protocol itself." "Beautifully said," murmured the Countess of Northbridge. That kind of wisdom suggests a deep understanding of both the letter and the spirit of diplomatic tradition. Catherine felt a moment of satisfaction at successfully navigating the test, but her triumph was immediately overshadowed by another wave of intense physical discomfort. She was beginning to worry that her condition might be more serious than just a simple stomach upset, but even this concern could not override her determination to see the evening through to its proper conclusion. The conversation had turned to cultural exchanges, with several guests discussing the possibility of arranging educational programs that would allow young people from their various kingdoms to study abroad. Catherine tried to participate in this discussion, as education was a topic she was passionate about, but she found it increasingly difficult to form coherent thoughts as her body's distress intensified. Education, she managed to contribute, has always been the most effective tool for building lasting peace between nations. When people understand each other's cultures and perspectives, it becomes much harder to view them as enemies. King Edward nodded approvingly at his daughter's contribution, though Catherine could see that his concern for her welfare was growing stronger. The internal conflict he was experiencing was evident in his expression, and Catherine felt guilty for putting him in such an impossible position between his paternal instincts and his royal obligations. The palace clock chimed 10 o'clock, indicating that the dinner had already lasted over 3 hours. Catherine knew from experience that these formal events typically concluded around 10:30 or 11 o'clock, which meant she needed to endure for at least another 30 to 60 minutes. The prospect seemed almost impossible given her current state, but she also knew that she had no choice but to find the strength somewhere. As the evening progressed toward its eventual conclusion, Catherine found herself drawing on reserves of determination she had never known she possessed. Each moment of continued endurance felt like a small victory, proof that she could fulfill her royal obligations no matter what personal cost was involved. The ornate grandfather clock in the corner of the dining room chimed the half hour, its deep resonance seeming to vibrate through Catherine's entire being. 10:30. She had been enduring her increasingly severe discomfort for over an hour now, and every minute felt like an eternity. The pain had evolved from intermittent cramping to a constant, burning sensation that made it difficult to sit upright without swaying. "Princess," Lord Blackwood said, his voice cutting through the fog of her distress. You mentioned earlier your interest in historical diplomatic texts. I have recently acquired a fascinating manuscript from the archives of the ancient kingdom of Valeria. It details negotiation strategies that were considered revolutionary for their time. Catherine blinked hard, forcing herself to focus on his words. The room seemed to be tilting slightly, and she had to grip the edge of the table to maintain her balance. That sounds absolutely fascinating, she managed to reply, though her voice sounded distant even to her own ears. I would love to learn more about historical approaches to conflict resolution. But even as she spoke, Catherine felt a wave of dizziness that was stronger than anything she had experienced so far. The elaborate chandelier above seemed to be swaying, and the faces around the table appeared to blur and shift. She closed her eyes briefly, trying to regain her composure, but opening them again only made the disorientation worse. Prince Alessandro, who had been watching her carefully throughout the evening, leaned forward with unmistakable concern. Your Highness, I must insist that you consider your health. In my kingdom, we believe that true strength sometimes means acknowledging when we have reached our limits. His words were kind, but Catherine recognized the implications. If she admitted weakness now, it would not only break the fundamental rule that governed formal dinners, but it would also send a message to all the assembled dignitaries that the royal family lacked the fortitude necessary for serious diplomatic relationships. Every kingdom represented at this table would receive detailed reports about the evening's events, and any perceived weakness could affect future negotiations for years to come. I appreciate your concern, Catherine replied, though she had to pause mid-sentence as another wave of pain struck her. However, I have learned that the most meaningful conversations often occur during the latter part of the evening, when formal barriers have been lowered and genuine understanding can emerge. King Edward, who had been trying to maintain his attention on a conversation about military alliances, could no longer ignore his daughter's obvious distress. Catherine could see him struggling with the same impossible choice that she was facing: uphold protocol at all costs, or prioritize immediate human needs. The weight of his responsibility as both a father and a monarch was written clearly across his features. The Duchess of Westmere, who had been sitting next to Catherine throughout the evening, quietly placed her napkin on the table in a subtle gesture that could be interpreted as preparation to assist if Catherine needed help. The gesture was so discreet that most of the other guests missed it entirely, but Catherine recognized the kindness behind it and felt a surge of gratitude even as she knew she could not accept any assistance. Lord Blackwood, Catherine said, forcing herself to engage more actively in the conversation as a distraction from her physical state, you mentioned revolutionary negotiation strategies. I'm particularly interested in how historical diplomats managed to find common ground when their initial positions seemed irreconcilable. Lord Blackwood's eyes brightened with enthusiasm for his favorite subject, though Catherine could see that he too had noticed her pallor and the slight tremor in her voice. An excellent question, Your Highness. One of the most effective techniques involved what the ancient diplomats called the art of patient endurance. They believed that maintaining composure and commitment to the process, even under great personal stress, demonstrated character that could be trusted in long-term agreements. The irony of his words was not lost on Catherine, who was at that very moment demonstrating exactly the kind of endurance he was describing. But the philosophical discussion also provided her with a framework for understanding her own situation. She was not simply suffering through a difficult physical experience. She was proving her worthiness to inherit the diplomatic responsibilities that would one day be hers. That approach makes perfect sense, Catherine replied, though she had to pause to take a steadying breath. Diplomacy requires the ability to think beyond immediate circumstances and focus on long-term objectives. Personal discomfort becomes irrelevant when weighed against the greater good. Prince Alessandro nodded slowly, and Catherine sensed that her response had passed some kind of test. Precisely. In my experience, The most successful leaders are those who can demonstrate grace under pressure. It inspires confidence in their ability to make difficult decisions when the stakes are much higher than personal comfort. As the conversation continued around topics of leadership and responsibility, Catherine found herself entering a strange state of detached awareness. The pain was still present and intensifying, but she began to feel as if she was observing herself from outside her own body. She watched herself smile appropriately, nod at the right moments, and contribute meaningful comments to the discussion, all while battling physical distress that would have sent most people fleeing from the room. The Countess of Northbridge began sharing a story about a crisis her own kingdom had faced several years earlier, when a natural disaster had tested the leadership abilities of the entire royal family. The most remarkable thing, she said, was seeing how the young members of the royal family rose to the occasion. They worked for days without rest, coordinating relief efforts and maintaining morale among the people. It was a defining moment that proved their readiness for greater responsibilities. Catherine realized that she was experiencing her own defining moment. The specific nature of the test was unexpected and deeply personal, but the fundamental challenge was the same. Could she maintain her composure and fulfill her obligations when doing so required significant personal sacrifice? Leadership often reveals itself in unexpected ways. Catherine managed to contribute to the conversation. Sometimes the most important tests are the ones we don't see coming, when we must rely entirely on our training and principles rather than careful preparation. King Edward's expression showed both pride and anguish as he listened to his daughter's words. Catherine could see that he understood exactly what she was experiencing and admired her determination, even as his paternal instincts urged him to end her ordeal by rising from the table himself. But she also knew that he recognized, as she did, that a premature conclusion to the dinner could be interpreted as weakness by their guests and potentially undermine the evening's diplomatic achievements. The palace servants appeared with a final round of coffee and liqueurs, signaling that the formal portion of the evening was drawing toward close. However, Catherine knew from experience that even after this service was complete, there would typically be another 20 to 30 minutes of conversation before the king would officially conclude the dinner by rising from his seat. As she watched the servants move efficiently around the table, Catherine felt a moment of desperation. Her physical condition had deteriorated to the point where she was no longer confident in her ability to remain conscious, much less maintain the appearance of alert participation in the ongoing conversations. The room continued to tilt and sway around her, and she could feel perspiration forming despite the cool evening air. "Your Highness," Lord Blackwood said, "I hope we might continue our discussion about historical diplomatic texts at some future occasion. Your insights suggest a remarkable understanding of both historical precedents and their modern applications." "I would be honored," Catherine replied, though she had to concentrate hard to keep her voice steady. Learning from those who came before us is one of the most valuable tools we have for navigating current challenges. But even as she spoke these words, Catherine felt her strength beginning to fail in earnest. The combination of physical distress, mental strain, and sheer exhaustion was becoming overwhelming. She could feel herself reaching the limits of what willpower alone could accomplish, and the realization terrified her because she knew there was still no acceptable way to leave the table. Prince Alessandro seemed to sense her growing desperation, and his expression showed a mixture of admiration and concern that suggested he was witnessing something extraordinary. "Princess Catherine," he said quietly, "your dedication to protocol and your guests' comfort is remarkable. In my travels, I have rarely encountered such commitment to diplomatic courtesy." His words were clearly intended as both a compliment and an acknowledgement of what she was enduring. Catherine felt grateful for his recognition, even as she wondered whether he might be preparing to report back to his own kingdom about both her strength and the extremes to which her father's court expected such strength to be demonstrated. "Thank you," she replied simply, knowing that any longer response might reveal just how precarious her situation had become. The conversation around the table had become more relaxed and personal as the evening progressed, with guests sharing stories about their families, their travels, and their hopes for future cooperation between their various kingdoms. Under normal circumstances, Catherine would have treasured this opportunity to learn about different cultures and perspectives from such distinguished visitors. Tonight, however, she found herself fighting simply to remain present and aware. King Edward began what Catherine recognized as his traditional pre-conclusion remarks, expressing gratitude to the visiting dignitaries and summarizing some of the promising discussions that had taken place throughout the evening. His words were gracious and diplomatic, but Catherine could hear the subtle note of concern in his voice that suggested he, too, was reaching the limits of his ability to continue the evening while watching his daughter's obvious distress. Before we conclude this memorable evening, the king said, "I want to express my appreciation for the wisdom and good fellowship that all of you have brought to our table tonight. The foundations we have laid for future cooperation will benefit our people for generations to come." Catherine felt a surge of relief at the word conclude, but she also knew that even these final remarks would take several more minutes, and that the formal process of the king rising and officially ending the dinner would take additional time. Every minute now felt like an hour as she struggled to maintain consciousness and composure. The assembled dignitaries responded with their own expressions of gratitude and appreciation, each speaking briefly about their hopes for continued friendship and cooperation. Catherine listened to their words through what felt like a thick fog, understanding their importance intellectually while fighting to process them emotionally as her body's demands became increasingly impossible to ignore. As the final guest finished speaking, Catherine realized that the moment she had been both anticipating and dreading was finally approaching. The formal conclusion of the dinner when her father would rise from his seat, officially releasing all the guests from their obligation to remain at the table. But she also realized that her current state was so precarious that she was no longer certain she would be able to stand when that moment arrived, even though her ordeal would technically be over. King Edward stood slowly, his movement deliberate and dignified as he placed his napkin beside his plate. The moment Catherine had been desperately waiting for had finally arrived, but as she attempted to rise with the other guests, her legs buckled beneath her. The room spun violently, and she gripped the edge of the table with both hands to prevent herself from collapsing entirely. "Your Highness," the Duchess of Westmere exclaimed, immediately moving to Catherine's side as the assembled dignitaries looked on with alarm and concern. Catherine's vision blurred, and she felt herself swaying dangerously despite her grip on the table. The months of preparation, the hours of endurance, and the successful navigation of one of the most important diplomatic dinners in her kingdom's recent history had pushed her body beyond its limits. Even though she had technically fulfilled her obligation by remaining seated until the king rose, her physical collapse was now threatening to overshadow everything she had sacrificed to achieve. "I apologize," Catherine whispered, her voice barely audible as she struggled to remain upright. "I seem to have..." But before she could finish her sentence, the room tilted completely, and she felt herself falling despite the Duchess's attempts to steady her. Prince Alessandro moved swiftly to her other side, and together he and the Duchess managed to lower her gently into her chair before she could hit the floor. King Edward was beside his daughter in an instant, his royal composure finally giving way to paternal concern. "Catherine, my dear girl," he said softly, his hand gentle on her shoulder as he knelt beside her chair. "You've done magnificently, but we must get you to your chambers immediately." The assembled dignitaries gathered around with expressions of genuine worry and respect. Lord Blackwood, who had observed Catherine's struggle throughout the evening, shook his head in amazement. "Your Majesty, I must say that in 30 years of diplomatic service, I have never witnessed such dedication to protocol and courtesy." Princess Catherine's commitment to ensuring this evening's success, despite her obvious distress, demonstrates character that is truly exceptional. Indeed, agreed the Countess of Northbridge. Her determination to fulfill her obligations, regardless of personal cost, speaks volumes about the values and strength of your royal family. This is precisely the kind of reliability and honor that makes for trustworthy diplomatic partnerships. Prince Alessandro, still supporting Catherine's arm, looked directly at King Edward. Your Majesty, what we have witnessed tonight is not weakness, but rather strength of the highest order. Princess Catherine has demonstrated that your kingdom's word can be trusted even under the most challenging circumstances. This is the foundation upon which lasting alliances are built. Catherine, despite her weakened state, felt a profound sense of accomplishment wash over her. She had not only successfully maintained protocol throughout the entire dinner, but had also somehow managed to turn her ordeal into a demonstration of her kingdom's reliability and strength. The very sacrifice that had nearly overwhelmed her had become proof of exactly the qualities these diplomatic guests most valued. "Thank you all for your understanding," she managed to say, her voice still weak but clearly audible. "This evening has been one of the most valuable experiences of my life. Your wisdom and fellowship have made every moment worthwhile." Mrs. Hartwell appeared at the dining room entrance, having been summoned by one of the servants who had witnessed Catherine's collapse. Her face showed both concern for her young mistress and pride in what she had observed throughout the evening. "Mrs. Hartwell," King Edward said, "please assist the princess to her chambers and summon the royal physician immediately." As Mrs. Hartwell and the Duchess helped Catherine to her feet, she found that although she was still weak and unsteady, her strength was beginning to return now that the tremendous pressure of maintaining protocol had been lifted. The relief of having successfully completed her obligations was almost as overwhelming as the physical distress had been. "Before I retire," Catherine said, turning to address the assembled guests one final time, "I want to express my deepest gratitude for your patience and understanding tonight. The conversations we have shared will remain with me always, and I look forward to the friendships and partnerships that I believe will grow from this evening." Lord Blackwood stepped forward and bowed formally. "Princess Catherine, it has been an honor to witness such dedication. I will ensure that the accounts of this evening that reach my kingdom emphasize not only the successful negotiations, but also the exceptional character demonstrated by the royal family." As Catherine was slowly escorted from the dining room, she could hear the continued conversations behind her. Rather than the diplomatic disaster she had feared her condition might create, the evening's conclusion had actually strengthened the positive impressions the guest had formed. Her struggle and ultimate success had become a testament to her kingdom's values and reliability. "Your Highness," Mrs. Hartwell said gently as they made their way through the palace corridors, "what you accomplished tonight was extraordinary. I have served this royal family for 30 years, and I have never seen such grace under pressure." When they reached Catherine's chambers, Mrs. Hartwell helped her into comfortable clothing and ensured she was settled in bed before the royal physician arrived. Dr. Morrison, who had served the royal family for over 2 decades, examined Catherine carefully and determined that she was suffering from a severe case of food poisoning, likely from something she had eaten earlier in the day before the dinner. "Your Highness," Dr. Morrison said as he completed his examination, "I must say that continuing to fulfill your obligations while experiencing this level of illness shows remarkable fortitude. Most people would have been unable to remain conscious, much less maintain diplomatic composure." Catherine smiled weakly. "The rule was absolute, Dr. Morrison. There was no acceptable alternative." King Edward arrived at Catherine's chambers as Dr. Morrison was preparing to leave. The physician assured the king that although Catherine had pushed herself to dangerous limits, she would recover completely with rest and proper care. "Father," Catherine said as the king sat beside her bed, "I'm sorry if I caused you worry tonight, but I couldn't let the evening be disrupted when so much was at stake." King Edward took his daughter's hand gently. "Catherine, you have nothing to apologize for. What you demonstrated tonight was not just adherence to protocol, but the very essence of royal duty. You chose the welfare of your kingdom over your own comfort, and you did so with such grace that our guests were inspired rather than concerned." Over the following days, as Catherine recovered her strength, reports from the evening began to reach the palace from various diplomatic channels. Every account emphasized not only the successful negotiations and agreements that had been reached, but also the exceptional character demonstrated by the princess. The story of her determination to maintain protocol despite obvious illness had become a diplomatic legend, shared among royal courts throughout the region as an example of ideal royal behavior. Prince Alessandro's formal report to his own kingdom included a specific recommendation that future diplomatic agreements with Catherine's nation should be prioritized because of the reliability and honor demonstrated by the royal family. Lord Blackwood's account emphasized the potential for long-term partnerships with a monarchy that valued commitment over convenience. The Countess of Northbridge reported that the evening had convinced her of the wisdom of the proposed trade agreements, because they would be partnerships with people who honored their obligations regardless of personal cost. Several weeks later, Catherine received a personal letter from Prince Alessandro that read, in part, "Your Highness, I have traveled to many kingdoms and witnessed many demonstrations of royal protocol, but I have never seen anything that impressed me as much as your dedication to duty and courtesy during our dinner. You have set a standard for diplomatic behavior that I will carry with me throughout my career." As Catherine read these various accounts and letters, she realized that her adherence to the single rule about never leaving the table before the king had accomplished far more than simply avoiding a breach of protocol. It had become a defining moment that would influence diplomatic relationships for years to come, and had established her reputation as someone whose word could be trusted under any circumstances. Mrs. Hartwell, who had become even more devoted to Catherine after witnessing her extraordinary display of duty, often reflected on the evening when training younger members of the palace staff. "True nobility," she would say, "is not about titles or wealth. It is about choosing to do what is right even when doing so requires great personal sacrifice." Princess Catherine demonstrated that night what it truly means to serve something greater than oneself. Years later, when Catherine had become queen and was hosting her own diplomatic dinners, she would often think about that defining evening. The single rule that had seemed so absolute and unbreakable had indeed been maintained, but, more importantly, the experience had taught her that royal obligations were not burdens to be endured, but opportunities to demonstrate the values that made leadership meaningful. The rule about never leaving the dining table before the monarch was still followed in Catherine's court, but it was understood by all who served there that the true purpose of such protocols was not arbitrary control, but rather the cultivation of character that could be trusted with the greatest responsibilities. Catherine's night of endurance had proven that when principles are truly understood and embraced, even the most difficult obligations become expressions of strength rather than sources of suffering. In the diplomatic history books that would be written about this era, the evening would be remembered not for the specific agreements that were negotiated, important as those were, but for the demonstration of character that made all future negotiations more productive. Princess Catherine's adherence to protocol under extreme duress had created a foundation of trust that would benefit her kingdom's international relationships for generations. The single rule she had never broken had, in the end, broken down barriers between nations and established new standards for what diplomatic commitment could achieve when supported by genuine character and unwavering determination to honor one's obligations regardless of personal cost.